We are back. It's the Joe Holka Show presented by Line Movement. It is Thanksgiving week, and despite some of the chaos with some of these games, obviously losing one of them on moving to Sunday because of COVID-19, is there anything more 2020 than losing a Thanksgiving hammer? Just brutal. Still a lot to discuss today with my man, Rich Hirbar. You guys know him from the worksheet at sharpfootballanalysis.com. Rich, before we get into this entire mess, I do appreciate you coming on for a double segment today. Talk about Thanksgiving. One thing I'm thankful for is 30 minutes with you today instead of 15. But how did week 11 treat you overall, my man?
Week 11 was great. We're back, after just kind of just bubbling in the week before. Last week was great. It was a really good week. What's funny is you extend out to 30 minutes, but it still won't be enough time for me. I'll still have stuff I'll be mad I didn't
Yeah.
get to and talk about on the show, but I'll make the most of it.
Yep. We could just go forever. That's what's like. It's good to get you in, get you out. I know you're a busy guy, but I was excited when we got to, I guess, add a segment to our plate this week and talk through some stacks, man. We've gotten into this routine of talking through a couple different games on the main slate, but excited to kind of get your, thought process on some of the stacks overall. So we're just going to go through some of your favorites for the Thanksgiving slate overall. We were just chatting about it, I guess, before we hit live here. But it doesn't look like they're going to just leave your money tied up through Sunday. This Pittsburgh and Baltimore game no longer on the Thanksgiving slate, man. What a bummer.
Yeah, it is a bummer, and I didn't really have like a great feel for it anyways with the amount of guys that are gonna be out. But just having those players in the player pool, and especially the Steelers side, you've got an undefeated team that's popular. They've got popular players. Those guys were gonna be owned. At least the Steelers side, the Ravens side, people were definitely probably talk themselves back into Marquise Brown, like the 10th straight week of Marquise Brown. This is the week because if you've already done it for 6 weeks. You gotta go 7. You gotta go
I
8.
would have been there. I can't say I wouldn't have been. I would have been there, Reeves. So maybe this whole thing is like just such a blessing in disguise. Because now I don't even have to think about it, man. I didn't think about it that way. Always a glass half full with Rich. So I love that, man.
I mean, it's a bummer because it's going to be a high-profile game, though, and obviously, it's kind of the way this shapes out now is that the Lions are the pivot, and nobody wants to do it, but they are the pivot, man. Like the Detroit Lions are the pivot, and I get it, but they just got shut out by the Carolina Panthers. It's a bad, just terrible look for them. We don't even know right now if two of their better players are going to play. Kenny Galladay practiced on Monday, then Tuesday DNP'd. We're waiting on word today. Right before the show, I tried to look up for the latest news and see things, but there was no practice news yet for the Lions. So if someone has it, you can drop on the chat. Cool. We're looking because DeAndre Swift was limited yesterday, but it doesn't get him out of the clear because tomorrow is still just 7 days since he was put in the protocol. So he didn't go in the protocol on Monday last week. It wasn't until Thursday he went into the concussion protocol. He had symptoms later in the week. So it'll just be 7 days. So that's kind of toeing the line for him to get cleared. And kind of bad news for everyone too that is looking for the J.K. Dobbins breakout. And I know it's kind of that game was removed and we were going to talk about it. But J.K. Dobbins, the Ravens play on Thursday next week as well. So with him being a COVID positive, he's not going to play next Thursday either after they finally unhinged him last week against the Titans, and they swerved into finally Dobbins being the lead back. He's going to miss 2 games now. And if you're someone that traded for Swift and he doesn't play tomorrow, you have now missed the Carolina Panthers matchup and a Houston Texans matchup. But, fingers crossed, though, he is not ruled out. So fingers crossed on DeAndre Swift. But the Lions, I believe, are going to be the pivot because when you look at this game against the Houston Texans, we've got Detroit is 31st in the league in points allowed per possession. Houston is 28th. 78% of the scoring plays against Detroit this season have been touchdowns at 31st in the NFL. Well, 69.6% of the scoring plays against Houston have been touchdowns. That's 30th in the league. So there's going to be a potential for back and forth. And Deshaun Watson's going to be so heavily owned. And I think he's the easiest guy to make case for. But he's going to be so heavily owned that if this game shoots out and Matthew Stafford comes in and is going to be 20% owned, as Watson, what are you guessing? 60% on Watson, maybe?
Probably, man. I would be shocked if he's not like far and away the highest owned quarterback now for sure.
Now, and everyone, if Galladay's out, is going to point to the splits that Stafford has, with and without Galladay on the field. But think about this though: Stafford with Galladay out still threw for 3 passing touchdowns against the Washington football team. He still threw for 3 passing touchdowns against the Indianapolis Colts a couple weeks ago. 2 of the better pass defenses that we look for, like on a matchup sense, to kind of avoid. So, I mean, now he's getting a positive matchup against a team that doesn't rush the passer. Houston's 28th in the league in passing points allowed per game. I mean, it just makes sense that if this game is going to pop and everyone's on Watson scoring points, that if the Lions are going to have to put up points, that Stafford is an objectively good leverage play. And the Lions are as well. So, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how people play it. So, I mean, I think Stafford, Marvin Jones, if Galladay's out, TJ Hockenson, running those guys is going to be probably the way you get leverage with this game now being removed, the night game being removed. I think that this is the game that is going to shoot out. If one does between the two, you have to say this one, right?
I like this game overall. So like just talking, I guess, about what the potential stack would be in this one, just to kind of skip over your first one. We can talk about Watson for years, I guess, in that stack. It is going to be a lot more popular. But I'm interested in the Stafford, Marvin Jones stack. I guess this offense has just been so unpredictable, Reeves. Like I struggle, obviously, with everything they have going on in the running game right now. I guess fingers crossed that we get DeAndre Swift. That would be fantastic in this matchup for all the reasons that you just outlined. Hockenson feels a little bit touchdown dependent for me based on his price. But I guess if you look into some of the data a little bit more, only Mark Andrews a higher target per route run on the slate originally, but now we don't have Mark Andrews. So I don't love the price for Hockenson or the ceiling personally. And now that we don't have Andrews, like I don't even know where the ownership's going to go at tight end now. Do you have any interest in any of these like secondary pieces like Marvin Hall if we don't have any Kenny Galladay? Obviously, if Swift is back, he's just an absolute smash.
Yeah, I mean, if Danny Amendola plays too, I think he's on the board. If you look at his target splits, especially with Galladay out, I mean, this is when we get in these short slates, it's always weird. You're always talking about weird players that can help you out in a slate, and you're looking for cheap guys. The thing about this slate now is with all these pieces getting removed in the night game is where do you really need the salary to save stuff? If you want to, you don't really have to play Kiki QT. You don't have to play the Amendolas. You don't have to do it anymore. But those guys at ownership. So I mean, we're now looking with that game being removed is like you're probably better off leaving a chunk of money on the table here. In these tournament lineups.
Salary's like irrelevant now for sure. Because like you can build whatever you want, literally. So that's going to be like, there's going to be people that just aren't willing to do that. I'm not opposed to even leaving like $1,000, $1,500 on the table to get just some unique type of teams. The last thing you want is duped teams on a 2-game slate. So the pricing is going to be so soft now on
just
both
a showdown
sites.
slate at that point.
Basically. Yeah, which is crazy. One of the guys that I was on Pat Mayo's show earlier this week that he brought up, Jamal Agnew, he saw 6 targets last week. He only turned that into 3 receptions for 10 yards. He's a former cornerback turned wide receiver. He's very cheap in showdown, but can you see yourself adding Jamal Agnew to any of these stacks just to be different, or is it just super thin?
Yeah, probably not, but maybe that's what we talk about. Who was the tight end that the Bears had last year that everyone wanted to play? Holtz, or was it Holtz or Holt? His name's eluded me. I'm usually good at that stuff too.
Yeah.
But and he caught the one pass and it was a touchdown, and everyone was happy. I mean, there's gonna be the potential on any time on these slates for these guys to kind of be those kind of players that you would find uniqueness in. So I mean, I'm not opposed to it at any level because the players that we're going to talk about, I mean, they're all going to have at least some ownership. A decent amount of ownership. And obviously Watson and those guys are going to have so much ownership on the Houston side. I mean, one thing to think about too with this Kiki QT injury is what if they don't just play Kiki QT for Randall Cobb? What if now they play more 2 tight end sets?
It's possible.
With now you've got Jordan Akins and Darren Fells playing more snaps. Maybe one of those tight ends hits. It's not just it might not just be a one-off where they just swap in QT and he does everything Randall Cobb does. They may alter their approach a little bit too, especially if they're favorites and they're able to run the football a little bit. Neither of these teams, the funny thing is that neither of these teams are good at stopping the run, but neither of these teams are also good at running the ball.
True. The pieces don't fit together seamlessly. I think that's sharp though. I think that's one mistake that sometimes we can kind of fall into, or a trap that we can fall into. We see these injuries and you're like, oh, Kiki's just going to walk in to the same target share, the same role. And I don't think that's always necessarily true. We've already seen Darren Fells at least have a red zone role, and Akins last week has a career high in receiving yards on not many snaps. So like if they just scale him up a little bit and you get him at drastically lower ownership, I definitely think that's interesting. So just say if you are going to go with like
play Watson, because obviously if you play Watson, if you're one of the 60%, listen, I'm going to have Watson lineups too.
Yeah.
I think I'm probably going to come under just because I think you have to. But everyone's going to pair him with who? Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks, probably both in the same lineup.
Right.
So, I mean, I get it. And that's you run it back with Swift. There's your natural correlated game stack that you would have gotten to anyways on like a regular week. If this was on a Sunday, that would be a stack we would play on a Sunday.
Yeah.
A game block. So people are definitely going to do it on a 2-game slate. So if you want to play Watson, I feel like you have to get unique with Watson, and you have to hope that those touchdowns that he throws don't go to Fuller. They don't go to Cooks. Maybe you play once. Like, you got to get an
like last
touchdown.
Week. He had 30-some points last week, didn't throw a touchdown to Fuller or Cooks. So, like, the Watson stacks were not good enough to win last week after what Justin Herbert did. So you got to think about that. I've been adding in Aiken shares and Fells shares, like, along the way this year, just because tight end's been so brutal with Watson teams, just adding to that correlation. So I'll probably end up doing that again this week. If we did go on the other side of this game, I know you mentioned Stafford and Marvin Jones as a stack. Do you have a preferred bring back if it did want to be? I mean, even if it's popular, do you like bringing it back with Cooks? Do you like bringing it back with Fuller? What's I guess, how are you differentiating those two guys this week in this matchup?
Well, I'm always more, even with the target share, kind of swifty or shifting towards, Brandon Cooks. The high leverage targets are still kind of Will Fuller's bag. Like, he's still getting, more end zone targets. He's still, at a career high, yards per catch. So he still has the high leverage targets, and he's got the 6 touchdowns to Brandon Cooks' 3. So, I mean, I'm looking at those high leverage targets, and I would say even if he's chalky, it would be Will Fuller. I mean, you're not going to avoid chalk on the slate. You're not. I mean, so don't be like just constantly thinking about that being completely contrarian. Because if you come in 100% contrarian, you're not going to be good either.
Let's talk about the second game before we run out of time on our stacks segment here. So this is one that I actually think that this does have a chance to be a little bit more high scoring. Dallas does like to run at a faster pace overall. The problem is Dallas's offensive line versus Washington's defensive line. That's going to be a big problem for Andy Dalton in this one. So your first stack that you had for this game was actually Gibson plus Washington D. Tell us why you like that stack so much.
Yeah, because I think so I was on the Minnesota-Dallas game stack last week. I was really investing a lot into it as the week went on, because I just kept telling myself, like, there's no way Andy Dalton's this bad. Like, he has a baseline of, like, I don't think he's good, but, he's at least got adequate in his range of outcomes. Right. And he kind of was that last week, but when you look at last week, how this played out against the Minnesota defense that hasn't had Danielle Hunter all season. They trade Yannick Ngakoue. They don't pressure the quarterback at all. Andy Dalton was under pressure for just 12% of his dropbacks. His first 2 starts, 29% against Arizona, 46% the time he played the football team. 40, he was under pressure. So people are going to look at the shuffle up the Dallas offensive line had, kind of, not overlooked what Minnesota brings to the table and how often they don't pressure anybody, let alone Andy Dalton, and maybe kind of say, like, yeah, well, they're not going to be able to get as much heat as they did last time, which I think could be a mistake, in this game. So, I mean, I think Washington puts a lot of pressure on him. And then you look at Dalton, he didn't get any pressure. He was under pressure for 12% of his dropbacks. He only averaged 6.3 yards an attempt against Minnesota. Like, so it wasn't even like he tore it up. Like, he got there on touchdowns alone. Yep. And, short touchdown passes at that. So you look at Washington, opposing teams have run just 24 plays inside of the 10-yard line against Washington this season, just 11 plays inside the 5-yard line. Those are the fewest in the NFL in both areas. Teams don't sustain drives against them. They'll give up some long touchdowns, but I don't know if Andy Dalton's capable of producing long touchdowns. I feel like the Dallas has to knock on the door for him to get there, unless you catch one of these guys, maybe a yarder for the catch guy. But I mean, does Dallas really, outside of CeeDee Lamb, have one of those guys right now that can take a slant and turn into, a 60-yard gain? I'm not sure that that's probable. So, I mean, do they sustain drives? Because the way that you score on Washington is hitting splash plays against them. And I just don't know if Dallas is capable of doing that right now. And then I look at this, people are going to look at it and say, well, yeah, the first game won't equal a second game. But I still think that Washington's a very live dog here, just with them being on the road. I think they match up with Dallas very well. You hit upon the defensive line. And Antonio Gibson, in the 2 games where they've had really positive game script, he's smashed in those games. That's why we talked about it last week we talked about Antonio Gibson on the matchup show last week. And, with positive game script, he's going to stack touches. 17 touches last week in positive game script, 20 the first time these two teams met. There's 2 highest touches in a game. And then there's an inverse correlation, obviously, with J.D. McKissic. You look at all J.D. McKissic's targets. We said, well, people were going to latch onto him and glom onto the 29 targets he had the 2 weeks before. We said, well, wait a second. If Washington is going to control the game script, J.D. McKissic only had 2 targets in the last game that they won. And last week, what happens? He doesn't, he doesn't get any looks, doesn't get the opportunities. He's had an okay game. I feel like in a slate like this too, it could be a potential where you pair both these guys together.
100%.
You can pair, and then you cover your game script angle,
Yep,
or as
doesn't
the game
matter.
script changes in games. The
Eh,
game script can flip in games. Think about the Detroit game
mhm.
where McKissick gets 29 targets, but each time they got inside the 5-yard line, you get 2 touchdowns from Gibson. They both kind of get there. McKissick actually did get a short yard touchdown in that game as well. But you may be able to pair those guys together as well. Obviously, McLaurin's going to be really popular on the slate.
Mhm.
But I do like going back to, because I do think that Washington is a live dog and can control game script still in this game.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 2-game slate now, right? So we got to figure out different ways in roster construction to be different as well. So I don't mind Gibson and McKissick together whatsoever. I think one thing that's at least interesting about Gibson, he's only $800 cheaper than Zeke. You mentioned your concerns with them just moving the ball in general, but Zeke still 23, 20, 20 touches over the last 3 games. So he's still getting a decent amount of run. They're getting healthier on the offensive line. Just not an amazing spot overall, but if they are going to try and, I guess, slow down this pass rush, they would probably want to establish the run a little bit as well. Terry McLaurin did have an ankle injury, which we should mention, but it looks like he's going to be okay. My biggest concern with this game, Reeves, and one that I'm still struggling with overall, it is like just the pass catchers for Dallas. It's been so spread out with Andy Dalton in general. I believe there's not one of those guys, including the tight end, that has surpassed a 20% target share with Andy Dalton under center. Gallup is very cheap. He's leaving a lot of air yards on the field, so maybe he's that game breaker for a cheaper price. But I mean, CeeDee Lamb, you would think that he's going to kind of be the security blanket for Dalton in this spot. Wouldn't you think? Do you have any preference, I guess, on some of these wide receivers for Dallas?
I mean, it looks like Cooper has kind of established himself as like the floor guy.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Cooper, he's like constantly turning in, like, if you look at 5, he's had at least 5 receptions or 67 yards in 4 of his 5 games post Dak Prescott. And we always look, when we want to fade Amari Cooper, what's the first thing we look to? Does he face like a shutdown corner? I know you're not a big cornerback match guy, but literally look at Amari Cooper's entire career.
Yeah.
And when he has bad spots, it's always against the cornerback. Look at his 2 down games this week: James Bradbury, Darius Slay. Every other game he's had a safe floor. He's had a nice safe floor. He's not cashing in those ceiling moments, but I don't know if anyone is capable of a ceiling, that was equal to Dak Prescott, at least in our minds. We've had to recalibrate since the loss of Dak Prescott. But he's been a guy that's kind of consistently churning out these 5 for 70s, these 6 for, he's getting there, Amari. Now with the big leverage, he's caught 20 of 25 targets, 2 from Andy Dalton. So he's been efficient on the targets he's getting as well, where Lamb's been kind of more touchdown dependent. The yardage hasn't always been there. He didn't even have a reception when these 2 teams played earlier in the season. I definitely will suggest that he catches a pass on Thursday.
Yeah, let's solve that.
But look at, he's doing a little more touchdown dependent. He's at a lower floor than what he had with Dak Prescott, and that's inherent anyways. Like, there was no way Dallas was going to sustain just having 50 dropbacks a game anyways, so we would have fought that regression battle with Dak regardless. But definitely gets accelerated when you had all these quarterback changes. You talked about Gallup. I mean, with Dalton, he's caught just 7 of 15 targets. Just not really been an efficient player all season, but when they do throw deep, it's going to be to Michael Gallup. And we talked about that's where Washington's been most vulnerable, is giving up touchdowns from outside of the red zone. When they do give up touchdowns, they're typically long passing touchdowns. So he would be the one guy that kind of correlates to that. And I know no one wants to play him, but I mean, that's kind of where we fit. And he's going to be easily the 3 of the guys that's the least owned of the Dallas pass catchers for reason, like we said, just objective reasons. And Dalton Schultz too is a guy I think people now will probably look at, that we lose Mark Andrews, we lose Eric Ebron. He scored a touchdown last week. He had just the 25 yards, and his yardage floor hasn't been good at all since Dak Prescott has gone, because who has done anything for the Cowboys? But yeah, I think people will look towards him as well this week to kind of make a pivot and get some of that game.
Yeah, I think just trying to figure out ways to leverage on this slate is going to be even more important now that it's only a 2-game slate. So we'll wrap this up with just being, I guess, just saying that you get different, definitely try and do different things with salary as well. Don't be opposed to just leaving a lot on the table overall. So we'll wrap up this portion of the stack segment for the Thanksgiving slate. Let me know in the comments what your favorite stack is. And we're going